Our meetings are recorded, and again, we are giving room for public comments in our meetings. And so if there's anyone from the public who would like to speak tonight, please raise your hand. And I'm gonna take comments outside of the room first, and then we'll get right to Angelo's. I just want to make sure. Uh, okay. So I think all the task force members should be panelists. If you're not a panelist, uh, and you feel you need to be, please raise your hand and let us know. Again, are there any public comments? Seeing that there are no public comments, are there any comments from any of the task force members? Anyone need to say anything before we get started? Hi, Brian, this is Catherine. Go right ahead.
Hey, Catherine, how are you doing?
Okay.
I just wanted to note that uh, of two of the licensed stores within Community Board 5 that I've dropped by in recent weeks are operating in violation of basic OCM guidelines. I'm talking about Culture House on 35th and 6th Avenue and a new place that's opening. Uh, it's 28 Nomad, which is on Broadway, and I think between 27th and 28th. Both are operating with their doors wide open to the street and security and staff verbally soliciting for customers to enter, standing alongside their sandwich boards. And I spoke to both facilities and I explained to them that you really need them to operate above and beyond reproach, and that these are fundamental basics of OCM guidelines. The door is supposed to be closed, security is supposed to be managing the door and checking for ID, and they are not supposed to be advertising with sandwich boards or soliciting on the sidewalk. Because
Thank
otherwise, why are we doing all this? You
Yeah,
know?
understood. So I'm gonna have some more to say about this specifically, but it's so noted in the task force meeting and will be uh, documented and moved forward. Again, I want to welcome the task force members. I don't know that I can share my screen. Just one moment. Do you all see my screen? Somebody let me know. Say something.
Yes,
Thank you. And Josh, the recording is on. Is that correct?
it is. I see that. Thank you.
Okay. So again, so tonight, and this will be every night, we will have public comments and input. That means anyone can show up and make comments. They'll have 2 minutes to speak. And so this is a new part, as well as our meetings will now be publicly posted on our calendar at CB5 and in our newsletter. And for those who haven't had a chance to look, this screen represents the current task force, which is comprised of CB5 leadership, members, neighborhood organizations, and public members. And most of us are here in attendance tonight, which is noteworthy. So just to remind us why we're doing what we're doing, we are in a public meeting. So I am reviewing the mission statement and how we got to this place.
Catherine, sorry to interrupt. I don't think the screen is showing what is on your screen.
It's not. Okay.
I see you're on the first slide.
Okay. Do you see community board, the mission statement now, the 4 points?
No.
So I'm gonna run through this. The slides are available in the calendar reminder. There's a PDF version available. I can put the link in the chat. I think a few of the task force members have already been looking, and that's great, but I want everyone to be able to follow along. So just give me a moment to add the slides, the link to the slides. Thank you for your patience. So I am putting the link to the slides in the chat. Everyone see the link to the slides? So that went to the panelists and to the public. Thank you, Janice. So again, we're just moving through the mission statement because some of us are new to the task force and because we do now have a public dimension to how we meet. So Community Board 5 formed the Cannabis Task Force to work under the State Licenses and Permits Committee. Basically, we have 4 prompts that move our focus and our efforts. We look at the ever-evolving regulations, the proposed regulations from the Office of Cannabis Management, and as it relates to specifically retail and on-site consumption cannabis establishments. We report back to SLAP with our findings. We interact with residents, businesses, neighbors, block associations on these matters. And we propose guidelines by which CB5 will review and evaluate upcoming applications for retail and on-site consumption. And we make comment to the Office of Cannabis Management. And then we also propose comments on enforcement and concerns and recommendations to OCM, NYPD, and other relevant agencies. So has it already been sort of revealed? Thank you, Brian, for getting this started. These are the 4 cannabis retail dispensaries currently operating in Community Board 5. These dispensaries are identifiable with the OCM, the Office of Cannabis Management verification tool. So everything else, I don't know what it is. These are the 4 establishments in Community Board 5. Some of which we've had interactions with. We'll talk about this more later. Some of which are locations which, based on location, we felt were not ideal places to operate dispensaries. I want to thank Jerry for reminding us that we do have different tools of reporting, and you can report suspected violations and complaints with our office by emailing office@cb5.org, but you can also report businesses and illicit activities via the cannabis website, and the link is on the slide, available in the chat. But these go directly to OCM. They do not come to us, but this has been established by the Office of Cannabis Management with New York State. I'll put the link in the chat. The slides will be available online. So I'm going to get right to, we're going to take a look at some aspects of the cannabis guidelines. I would like to ask Todd, if you have any opening remarks that you would like to make, as someone who helped us really pull together. I couldn't just say Todd. If Todd wants to chime in, Carlo, Jerry, Angelos, the team that's been here from the beginning is worth noting. If any of you have any comments or would like to talk about any aspect of the guidelines, please raise your hand and we'll let you get right to it. Todd, you're talking, but you're on mute, so you have to take yourself off mute, or no, you're still talking, Todd, and we don't hear you. I want to give you a minute. Does anyone, Francis, Carlo, Angelos, any of you, Jerry, if you're here?
I'm here. I don't have any comment this time, Catherine.
Okay, that's fine.
I just have a question.
Brian, go ahead.
So are we defining distance to schools or community facilities or harm reduction as line of sight or radius?
Walking distance, line of sight. Not necessarily. So that's some of the detail that we can get into in just a moment. I don't know why my screen is moving without me, but just give us a moment. Okay. So Todd, you can chime in along the way, but I just wanted to get us to the place, if we can stop the screen from moving.
Sorry, guys, I just sort of lost track. My screen has just gone bonkers.
Yeah,
Where
now
I
you're
miss-
here. We hear you. Go ahead, Todd.
What
No, we lost you again.
okay, was I invited for some input? My screen has gone
Yes,
bonkers.
you were invited for some input.
What did I miss?
We're getting ready to talk about the CB5 guideline revisions, but I just want you to give some comments on the history and some insights, because you've been through this process from the beginning.
So what I would say is everything that you see in the materials that Catherine distributed is where we are right now. But what we've seen is that we are on the bleeding edge of this process. So we've done a number of due diligence assignments before the floodgates opened. So we have some sense of, the sort of issues that will come up. CB5, as you've seen, has requirements that are outside of what's required by CCB in the state. And that's been evolving, although we had a cutback of necessity by the crush of applications in the first wave, and that, we're continuing to try to come up with things that make sense. I thought I heard something about, the measurements that we're using, or that people that look at our requirements see for the distance, for the different types of sites that we use to evaluate de novo. It's confusing. I can't even keep track of it myself half the time. But basically, for the most part, it's walking distance, right? So that's something that continues to evolve. Looking at the mission statement, I think that's that's where we are right now, right? And again, that's going to evolve based on what we see. And most importantly, number 4 is we hope to give feedback on the practical reality of what's happening on the streets to the state agencies, and that's an evolving process. Okay, so that's those of you who've been with us since the beginning, you know this to be true, and we want to try to reflect the needs and the ongoing concerns of our district. And I would just say that right now the perception, one of the things that I've been doing, and I've been sending to Catherine, and I suggest we put together a library of all of our research and correspondence and things in the press. One of the things I've been suggesting is that, it seems clear that within our district, the overwhelming number of unlicensed dispensaries and stores and people selling has made everything that we do that much more difficult. But that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. So at the last SLAP committee meeting, Janice, you did a really wonderful job of helping us to frame. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to just talk about, I'm looking at the slide where we talk about applicant, community, and CB5, and I'd like to welcome Janice. Janice is the new vice chair of the State Licenses and Permits Committee, and she's played an incredible role in helping us keep up with metrics that might help us to understand where potential cannabis applicants would locate their businesses and how that might look in the landscape of a densely populated community board 5 that also has quite a few public spaces and harm reduction facilities. Janice, do you want to give a few comments?
Catherine, real quickly though, Jerry Scup is in the attendees. You should elevate him to panelist.
So he's in transit, I know.
Oh,
Thank you.
Okay.
We talked about that. We're fine. And so if he needs to chime in, he's going to let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Catherine.
Hi.
Sure, happy to speak. I'm wondering if I can, let me see. Who is
I
sharing
can
screen
put
right
up the
now?
slide. Maybe we can make
Yeah.
post. I have the slides in the slide deck. Or Josh or someone. Josh, can you help us put up the slide? It's slide number 8 in the slide deck. Keep going. Keep going.
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
thank you.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, so as Catherine said, shared this at the last SLAP meeting that we had. And really the point of doing so was really to take the work that you have all been doing and just distill it for the broader public. So, and looking at what everyone has been doing so far, we really wanted to stress that a successful review process is going to be designed with people at the center. And the idea is that we want to balance the needs of everyone involved, which is the applicant, the community, and of course, us as the community board, who is doing the work to facilitate these positive relationships between everyone involved. So in doing so, you know, keeping in mind what everyone is trying to get out of this process and trying to make that all work together. So yeah, so the applicant, of course, wants to get a license with as little to no objection as possible. The community, of course, wants to make sure that they have their quality of life maintained for themselves. And again, we as the community board, we are trying to balance both of those needs so that we can all coexist within our community. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. Catherine, I don't know if you wanted me to go through.
So you don't have to go through
Okay.
all of it, but I think what Janice has done is tried to frame, in the early part of working through this process, we thought a lot about what we do at community meetings when we're reviewing liquor license applicants and where we're striking the balance between the applicant's method of operation and the community's quality of life. And that it is often necessary to have community input to shape a balanced outcome. And so I thought that Janice did a great job of offering that in a grid, in a way that helps us think about what we're doing when we're shaping guidelines and trying to move the work forward, because we're trying to move forward. That's the other theme. If you take anything away from tonight, we know a lot has happened, a lot hasn't happened, but we'd like to be moving forward. So any key points? In the history, we've been speaking to cannabis applicants when and where we can, when they come to us. In the early parts of the process, when we were solely looking at card licenses, we sat with applicants and talked beyond the scope of the location. We talked to them about their business plans and their operations, and we need to continue to be able to do that in a thoughtful and timely way. Next slide. So this gets at the heart of some of our guidelines. So you should look at the guidelines if you haven't. We talk about community facilities and may need to add some language about what we mean when we say community facility. And keep in mind that I say every 500 feet in New York City is a different neighborhood, a different place. And so when we're trying to define this, we're trying to define this in our context. OCM gives us very broad definitions, but where we need to, we want to be able to offer a little more context and definition.
Catherine, can I also add that the point of the slide was also to explain to the public that when the guidelines were first presented, you were all using the definition that was provided, the term and the definition that was provided at the time, which is community facility, with the definition laid out here. But since then, it's actually been narrowed by the state. So just something to public youth facility with the definition at the bottom there. But that's something that we might want to discuss as a committee going forward.
Mm-hmm. Next slide. So this gets also to the heart of where we've been reviewing OCM guidelines, state regulations, and where we fall. So I'd like to hear some comments on this slide about, should we offer this as a revision to our current guidelines, the school grounds. We define, so the challenge with walking distance in schools, a lot of the school facilities in particular are actually within buildings of mixed use capacity. This is New York City, so where a school can be involved, where a school can be located in its own right. In a lot of places, they're dedicated facilities, but in New York City, that's not the case. So let's talk about school grounds. Anyone want to offer some comments?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think 500 is it's too short of a distance. City block is 800 feet. If you have a school entrance on an avenue corner, you don't want to have a cannabis shop located on the same block. I mean, that's at least what I'm hearing from parents at a precinct community council level. I know these guidelines were designed at state level, and I think, Catherine, you pointed out, state level, you'll have school facilities that are standalone buildings on standalone blocks. That's not New York City. And I think it's problematic if you have a cannabis shop on the same street as a school. So I would vote for expanding that radius. There are plenty of streets in Manhattan that do not have schools on them.
Right. Any other comments?
Yes, Todd here. So first of all, the idea that the 500-foot rule is only with respect to dedicated buildings that are schools or churches is, as our community board has realized, is one that we should stick with, right? I mean, our guidelines are stricter and take into account the reality of New York City. And I agree with the previous comment that it makes no sense if you have a middle school or an elementary school or even a high school. You got all these small schools, many of them are just tenants in commercial buildings. 500 feet is hardly adequate, right? So I would say, I would recommend that we increase it to at least 750 feet and make the point that in our district, that's just the reality of people living here. I mean, my kids did go to a public school in the neighborhood. I wouldn't look kindly on it if within 500 feet of the building it was in, that there was, a cannabis dispensary, especially for the high school students, right? Because a lot of times they just get out early and they're just lounging around after the school hours. I mean, what is going on? That's something that I think we should bring back to our colleagues on the community board. It may not be easy, but it's the right thing to do.
Any other comments?
Well, I concur with Todd. I agree.
I
I
think
do want to
Mhm.
offer the correction. I think a city block, unless you're talking about an avenue block, I think a city block is only about 300 feet or so, maybe a little over that.
No, Janice, from avenue to avenue, it's 800 feet.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. If you're talking about avenue,
Yes.
which is equivalent to 3 blocks, sure.
No, but from avenue to avenue. So a lot of schools, if you have a school on 8th Avenue and you want to open a cannabis shop on the same block on 9th Avenue, that's a problem. So I think that, yes, that is a city block is 800 feet, and generally that's how we view things. So if, for example, let's take a block, let's say 25th Street, do you want to have on one end of 25th Street a cannabis store and on the other end of 25th Street a middle school? I don't think that's appropriate. I think you'll have parents showing up at meetings saying, what the hell is going on? Why are we allowing an applicant to consider this location? I'm sorry to be stringent about
No,
this,
no, no, I'm
but
not. No,
yeah,
I just wanted to clarify what
Yeah.
a city block is, since it's not a
Yeah.
perfect square.
right. Oh, no, it
So,
isn't. Right.
so
Sounds
there
like
are shorter blocks. So I just wanted
It
to clarify.
might be a more
So,
pragmatic solution to say on the same block face as the store, as the entrance to the school.
yeah, so state
Mhm.
law, I believe, is the way they measure it, is on the same road. So actually, even, right, even like the perpendicular road, unless the school was on a corner, wouldn't count. But the way that we've been interpreting it as the community board, because we are so dense, that's where the idea of walking distance comes from. Um, instead of just taking, one road.
Right. I mean, so here's a few things so I'm hearing that that there might be some consideration even to move to 750 feet. But is there also some way, I go back to Brian's comments about soliciting security, that these cannabis retail operations that are legal are supposed to they have in place the wherewithal to conduct their businesses in a way that doesn't make it such a luring, easy access for schools. But is it fair to say to the applicants to also be able to be I think what I'm struck by is how the applicant is not even aware of the schools or what else is in the neighborhood. What does that signal something for a stronger applicant who actually knows and understands the landscape of schools? I'm trying to bring some balance to I hear you all. I'm trying to bring some balance to what the cannabis applicant might engage in. Mhm.
I don't think that we have to, the cannabis applicant at the end of the day is a business. All right. And so that business will function according to whatever guidelines are set for them. And we as a community have to reflect community concerns. Now, that applicant can be within 500 feet of a school and have frosted glass and keep their doors closed and not adhere to OCM guidelines. The issue is, though, is that that applicant does not have control of their client base after they step out the front door.
Right.
So there's nothing to say that once that a customer goes in and makes their purchase, that they don't step out onto the street and smoke. And I think that's what people are very concerned about is cannabis use on the same street as a school or a place of worship or a substance abuse treatment facility. And those are the sort of pragmatic things that we have to concern ourselves with living in this densely populated area. Now, there's nothing to say that if the store is operated 750 feet away from the entrance of the school, those customers aren't going to walk around to the front of the school. But 750 feet gives us some breathing room, no pun intended.
Sure. So
Yeah.
again, I'm hearing about 750 feet. I'm also probably looking for giving the applicant or the public some sense as to why, which is what we're talking about. You've talked so clearly about, Brian, which is about the what happens beyond the business outside, right outside your doors in proximity to schools and harm reduction facilities. So maybe we could add some language there. Does anyone have any comments about houses of worship?
I'll just add that in Times Square, we have some really kind of unconventional places that are used as houses of worship. There's a church that uses the AMC movie theater on 42nd Street. They do multiple services a day and have youth programming there on Sundays. And someone else uses the Palladium Theater that's on 44th Street as well. So I think that it's good to recognize, as we kind of have in the yellow text here, that houses of worship are not necessarily in a city like New York always in a dedicated building, and they can be in all sorts of different spaces at different times.
Yes, I would like to, emphasize that as well. I agree with that comment. My temple was in 3 sites over the period of 10 years, and it shared space in a commercial building, just like the schools. Even my conference center was used on a regular basis as a place of worship by a number of small congregations. So there's no getting around in a city as big and diverse as New York City, that there's got to be some sort of holistic branch to our guidelines and approach of doing our due diligence that's going to take this into account. What we have now is, certainly the state regulations don't do that at all. But even our own guidelines, it might be worth making them more granular, right? Like, identifying the house of worship by, the kind of building it's in and who it shares its space with, and how big its congregation is. If we have a congregation that's 25 people, it's not the same as having 100 people or 150 people on a regular basis, bringing in their children. So that's something to think about. And I think it's inevitable that we're going to be, seeing that kind of have to make those kind of decisions, and having to report back to our committee and our full board about that as we work through this.
Yeah. So again, the challenge, just like with schools, there is no, Janice, maybe you can talk about the data, digging through the data, the deep dive through the data to find these locations and premises that are changing all the time. Is there a way to identify the unconventional houses of worship?
No, there really isn't.
Yeah.
A lot of the ones that I found were just through going through Google Maps. Like,
And then are
block
we
by
doing
block.
something else if we open a space for houses of worship and even schools that are in mixed buildings to tell us that they're, given that there are cannabis applications rolling through, forgive my words, rolling throughout the year, we could ask if you're a school or a harm reduction facility or a house of worship and you'd like to be put on a CB5 registry, could we do something like that? Because otherwise, we're not finding these places unless we are thankful for the expertise that Carlos gives us here as an example, that Garment District Alliance has already provided, but I'm not sure otherwise how we get to talk about these locations.
Yeah,
Well,
that's definitely been the challenge through this whole process, and trying to find where these houses of worship are, where the schools are, unless they own their own building, which is pretty rare in the city. It's very hard to find, even more so when we talk about, harm reduction facilities, which, I
well,
think are
so
purposely not
well,
listed.
so harm reduction facilities, though, and I believe Controller Brad Landers has recently, in efforts to look at fair share around the city, has recently mapped locations of harm reduction facilities. As it happens, CB5 was his test case study. So it's possible that we could reach out to their office.
Sure.
Part of the issue, though, of course, with asking shelters and harm reduction facilities is that we always get that response that for the privacy of clients, we won't give you that information, which is ridiculous because Community Board 4 has walked every street and mapped all of the facilities within its community board, and they've also mapped a number of them in Community Board 5 just for coordination and city resources. So that information is available. I don't anticipate the centers themselves will be forthcoming, but it is possible that schools would be forthcoming. And then regarding the house of worship issue, the challenge is, for example, there are a lot of facilities that, for example, prayer rooms are very common in Midtown, especially for delivery drivers. So For example, on my block, I have a food cart storage facility, but midday it's used as a prayer room. And I don't know if we would extend that 200-foot walking distance around that facility because it's
Yeah,
only
so-
used during parts of the day. You
Yeah,
know,
we get it. It becomes how you define. We get
yeah.
it. I am gonna move us, I feel like we've started some solid conversation. And the harm reduction facility is something we've talked about in the past. I'd like to move to have us discuss more about park and public spaces. What we found is that when we talk about public spaces, all public spaces are not created equal. Again, we're talking just about the same thing. The cannabis business runs just outside of a park. We see that as a challenge. We also see that as a challenge with public spaces that are operating in spaces where they, meet the need of the neighborhood, the triangles and the those spaces which are often parks are one example, but then a lot of the private spaces, how do we further delineate some of the public spaces if they're going to be a challenge or not?
So when you say the private public, that we're talking about like pops, right?
Pop
Pretty
spaces.
much, yeah. You know,
So- Mhm.
I mean, so it's like we have parks that are under the umbrella of Parks Department, and theoretically, there's no smoking in parks. It's always a challenge to enforce. We also have through CB5, prominent public plazas such as Herald Square in Greeley, and Madison Square. Well, that's a park, but I guess where things become more challenging is where we talk about those pops locations, and how they're used. And I came on after CB5 came up with the stipulation of not approving locations in proximity to public plazas and parks, which I applaud. I think that's a great idea, but I understand there's been considerable pushback against that.
When we talked about this in SLAP and in the prior um, cannabis task force meeting, we recognized that when we put all of these restrictions together, it makes the district very restrictive to cannabis applicants. But at the same time, what I offer is that we got over 100 applications. And what would we look like if we, how this rolls out has to be strategic and balance quality of life for residents and for these restrictive areas. So we're still trying to balance. I do think we have to give some more conversation and thought to some of these restrictive spaces and agree, so that we might bring more forward to SLAP in terms of a set of revisions. I don't think we're all the way through at this point. I don't want to hinder our conversation, but time is moving. What I will say, I want to move through some of the areas that there may not be slides for, but are in the guidelines. I want to move through when we see applicants, we're also working, and you'll get an email about this. We're also working to update our online cannabis application and to help you all understand the process. That's something I need to get to you as it sits now, the way in which we engage applicants, to be able to discuss beyond their premises and location, their hours of operation. And I ask you to take a careful look. I put it in the chat. It'll be in the meeting notes, and I ask you to continue to take a careful look at the process and to make comments. You can reach out to us, to me, to the Cannabis Task Force. We have the group email. You can start to really convene conversations. I'm going to make a few assignments before the next meeting, because I think we're starting to see, we're starting to feel our way through revisions and need to just have a little more discussion. We will, at the next meeting, have the Office of the Manhattan DA talk to us about their efforts with enforcement, because it's very difficult for us to, it's still challenging for us to have guideline conversations amidst lack of enforcement with illegal activity. I do ask you all to report where you can go on record. Thank you for being on record here, but I just want to go through some of the, we've talked about hours of operations in our guidelines. We're also talking about restricted licensing areas based on the history of CB5 and some of the areas in the 30s down to up to the 40s, 8th Avenue over to, over to Broadway and 7th Avenue. We want to look at some mapping still, and we still want to continue to look at our community engagement process, which I can't say enough about. We've talked to a number of prospective, potential, and those who are operating cannabis applicants, and it can't do anything but help if neighbors, businesses, and these cannabis dispensaries are not strangers to each other, that we know what is being sold and how it's being sold, is an education that we're all still trying to understand. So I'm not going to keep you all much further. I want to give a few minutes if there are any comments or questions, and then our next meeting will likely be April 18th. I haven't confirmed as yet, but you'll see it in your calendar, but that will be 6 o'clock. The next SLAP meeting is next week. We may have some discussion there on the agenda. And again, any comments, questions?
Catherine, I have a question and a comment. So question is, when forming the original guidelines, how much input did we have from the community?
So how do you define community, Janice?
So I would say, in addition to the people who are sitting,
Right, so it was
on
a
the task
task force effort to come up with the guidelines, but we open ourselves for comments and input. I would say that I don't have exact numbers, but from qualitative measures, we did hear from some residents. We heard from a mix of people who moved through the business of the local, the local businesses, as well as some of the co-op boards and condo boards. Some of the collective voices we did hear from and are represented through the task force. That's what, when we look at the task force, that's what we see is a wide-ranging set of people who can provide input. For instance, Brian Weber is on the Community Midtown South Council with NYPD, that he hears voices. So these are people who provide input. Maybe they start out saying my personal opinion, but then they remember, oh, but I'm not just saying this because I think it's a good idea, but this is what I hear from residents or other businesses. Same with the bid, same with Garment District Alliance, what they hear from in their daily interactions with harm reduction facilities, or 34th Street Partnership, what they hear from businesses in the district about other businesses. So that's, the task force itself has a community voice input component. When we hear from a particular applicant in a particular neighborhood, we do open up those conversations to the neighborhood that the business is operating. But in terms of pulling together the guidelines, it's the task force and the larger work of Community Board 5.
Catherine,
Yes.
I just have one other comment before we recess. So the four.
One moment, Todd. If we could just turn off the screen sharing. Thank you. Go ahead, Todd. Thank you.
Okay, so the third paragraph of our mission statement, where it says to propose guidelines by which CB5 will review and evaluate upcoming applications. And then it says 1, itemize specific, uniform, and objective criteria, define parameters for acceptable method of operation. That's all great and well established. I think we've seen that describes things. The only thing I would say, going back to what I said earlier, maybe there should be something in there to the effect that, and maybe there should be like, we got 1 and 2. Do I see that? Maybe there should be a little 3I in there that says something like, and where necessary, as required by the specific conditions of our district and its neighborhoods, to propose or consider other criteria that will assert the interests of our residents and districts. Because really, a holistic approach, because really that's what we're talking about. So somewhere, somehow, I think we should try to incorporate that into our mission statement, so that at least it's on the table, because we've already done it, but we should just put it up front in our mission statement so people see it. And when we come across these conditions with the schools and the houses of worship, everybody knows that, we're not scared to speak outside of the bounds of the state and, even our own objective criteria when necessary.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you for,
Yeah, and Catherine, just to complete my comment from before, which is related to what Todd just said around us making an argument as to why our guidelines differ from what the state guidelines suggest. I do think it's important for us, where we do differ from the state, that we justify why, why we believe that,
right.
Schools and houses of worship in that case, like, require a little bit more nuance than what the
Right.
state
That's
provides.
what I was trying to get, the explaining part. But to also be clear that we do have the space to be more specific. The OCM guidelines guide us as a community board to bring specificity to our efforts, so that and I'm happy to share the specific passages. We went through this in the early rounds, but that's also how we got to this process, that there is an expectation that we would weigh in on applicants. That's why they send us a notification that they're planning to open their business. They send an OCM, and Janice, you will hold me to, I will outline the process as it is, and so we can get it to where it needs to be. But an OCM, a cannabis applicant, sends a notification to a community board for the specific purpose that we might have a discussion about the context of time, place, and manner in our district. Okay. So with that, there is another meeting following this meeting, so not to rush us, but to know that we have space and that there's still some assignments, and we're still talking about revisions and guidelines in the pace of a new landscape and a new year. So thank you to the new members, to the folks that have been showing up, and again, continue to reach out, ask questions, and provide guidance. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Good night.
guys.